We're going to generally go over the accessibility requirements for service providers under the European Accessibility Act. So we're not going to cover each individual requirement, but I am going to give you context for these requirements, and then I will also give you a resource where it breaks down every single requirement in plain English so that you understand what all of the requirements are getting at. For now, what is on the screen with me is Annex 1. Underneath Annex 1, it reads Accessibility Requirements for Products and Services. And then we have Section 1. Section 1 is for products. So we're going to go ahead and scroll past that. We're also going to scroll past Section 2. And then we're going to get to Section 3. And it reads General Accessibility Requirements related to all services covered by this directive. So this is a really important section, and you're going to pay attention to the four letters in this section, and then also the sub-bullet points under letter B. These are all going to be accessibility requirements that you're going to implement to make sure that your services are accessible. And this applies to all service providers who are covered by the European Accessibility Act. Now, we're going to continue down, and then there's also Section 4. Section 4, underneath section 4, it reads additional accessibility requirements related to specific services. So here, you may not be covered, but if you see your specific service covered, then you also need to be aware of these requirements and meet these requirements so that you are compliant. And there are seven specific services that are listed out, and then there are requirements under these 7 services. So think of this as 2 different layers. The first layer, section 3, is going to apply to everybody, and then the second layer, section 4, may or may not apply to your service. Here you're just going to look through this section and see if it does. And so I'll just tell you towards the end of section 4, we have e-commerce services are covered, ebooks are covered. We also have consumer banking services covered, and then there are several requirements under each bullet point. So we'll leave it at that for now, but we're going to continue down the directive, and we are going to get to Annex 2. And then Annex 2 is very important because it is so helpful. So scrolling down Annex 2, we eventually come to the requirements in Section 3 of Annex 1. So here we have examples of meeting the requirements that are set out in Section 3. So this is very practical information that will help you as a service provider understand how to make your service accessible. So here are examples of how you would make your service accessible for these different requirements. And then when we continue down Annex 2, we also have Section 4, and then we have examples related to the additional accessibility requirements for specific services. So I point this out because Annex 2 is going to be extremely helpful to any service provider as they are making their services accessible. All right, so that is from the directive itself. Now we're going to go to accessible.org, and we're going to look at a specific post. And actually, I'm in the dashboard, the composer dashboard. I'm going to go to the actual public post, and I will link to this in the description for this video. But here we have a post on the European Accessibility Act service accessibility requirements. And I start off the post with an explainer. And this explainer really goes over the context I just provide you, but let's reiterate this. So think of the EAA as having 2 layers of requirements for service providers. The first layer is the general requirement. It's going to apply to everybody, so everybody needs to meet these requirements. And then the second layer has these additional requirements for 7 specific service types, because these services are so essential to daily life, and accessibility is particularly crucial here. So again, I covered e-commerce, ebooks, consumer banking. Those are all those are 3 different service types. There are also electronic communications, which include emergency services, audiovisual media services, long distance transport, and then local transport are also covered. So be aware of this if you fall under any of these service types, that you will need to meet additional requirements beyond those set out in Section 3. So an example here, let's say that you are a bank. So you're providing a banking service. You can't just make your website WCAG conformant and consider yourself compliant. And similarly, it won't just be that you provide customer support in an accessible manner. You also need to ensure that you've considered the 360 experience and made that accessible as well. So that's going to include security. That's also going to include the payment systems that you're using. You need to make sure that the banking experience is accessible for your customers. So you need to make sure that it's not just one aspect of your service that you've made accessible. You're considering your entire experience. And so that is in part what these requirements are getting at. It's not just one thing, it's making sure that the entire experience, the entire service is accessible. So it's like all facets of the service. All right, so that's a practical example of what's going on with Section 3 and Section 4 and the various requirements. Now, in the first part of this post, we get into what the actual definition of a service is, because we need to determine whether our service is covered. And so it generally is, and the definition isn't straightforward when you read the European Accessibility Act, and that is because they reference out another directive. So it gets slightly complicated, but what we've done in this post is provided our interpretation of the European Accessibility Act and what services mean, how they're defined under the EAA. So here's the definition. A service is any paid independent activity offered by a business or individual in the European Union market. Services encompass various sectors and are generally provided in exchange for money. So this can include industrial services, commercial services, craft services, so trade and artisanal work, and professional services, so legal, financial, consulting, etc. Now, this is just my interpretation of the European Accessibility Act, but this is here, and it's really here to help you make sense of not only just the requirements, but whether or not what you are doing, what you are offering, is covered under the services provision. All right, so now we scroll down to a section marked Annex 1, Section 3. Remember this from when we were looking at the directive. Here we go through each of the requirements. So each of the letters in Section 3, they are all covered in this section, and we break down in plain language what each requirement means, and that continues down to the sub-bullet points as well. And there are many examples. Again, I'm not going to cover all of these because I'm going to link to this post, and that way you can read from it and you can determine what these requirements are. But this does set out the requirements in plain language. All right, so we are scrolling down, and as we scroll down, you can guess that, of course, we are going to come to Section 4 of Annex 1. And then here we similarly have a breakdown of the 7 specific service types, and these are all listed out with bullet points with the highlighted requirements for each specific service type. So obviously this is meant to cover the majority of requirements under the EAA for service providers, but you always want to ultimately look at the directive itself for your requirements, but this is really a companion guide that's going to help you as you are working towards compliance. Remember this too, before we wrap up, that there are obligations for service providers that are outside of the technical accessibility requirements. So there are obligations and requirements under the EAA. You need to pay attention to both, but material accessibility will be found in Annex 1, and again, with the examples in Annex 2, those are going to help you understand what the requirements in Annex 1 are. All right, so for this post, we are now at the end. We have the summary, and the summary is that service providers need to be aware of underlying products that they use in the carrying out of their services. Those need to meet the EAA product accessibility requirements. And this is one thing that I skipped over as I was going through this post, but this is very important. So if you are using a product to help you carry out your service, you need to make sure that that product is accessible as well. Because remember what I talked about with experiences. We want to have the full 360 experience be accessible. It's not just one aspect. So if we are using a product to help us with our service, we need to make sure that that part of our service is accessible as well. So that is part of the requirements. And then we also get to the two sections where we have the general requirements, which are for everybody. And then we have the requirements for specific services. And then if you don't fall under any of the specific services, if you're not covered, then it's just the general requirements that you need to focus in on. So that is a nice summary and a nice guide to the accessibility requirements for service providers and services under the European Accessibility Act. If you need help with accessibility and compliance, feel free to reach out to me. I will include the contact page on accessible.org in the description. I will also include a services page as well as the guide that is currently on the screen with me. This guide is going to help you as you are working through accessibility and compliance. This guide will help you understand what is required of you. So I will link to these resources and more in the description for this video.